Good evening. Thank you for joining us. My name is Britt Rose, Professor of Social Work at Luther College, and I have the honor and privilege of moderating tonight's panel. Tonight's talk, Coping with the Pandemic, is part of an ongoing conversation series on campus called Here's My Story. Each of these forums is organized around a specific topic or theme, and students, faculty, staff, and community members are invited to hear each of the panelists' stories. We are all in the midst of a global pandemic. Some of our experiences are shared and others are unique to our individual circumstances. We've all developed a new vocabulary that includes the regular use of words and phrases like pandemic, Zoom, physical distancing, positivity rates, mask requirements, etc. The name of your governor is referenced nearly daily. We're getting used to familiar news anchors, epidemiologists, and public health experts that grace the screens of our televisions or news feeds on our devices. And we've all been thinking about the trade-offs of policy decisions and the related social, economic, and health implications. As a social worker, I've been particularly aware of how individual circumstances and identities intersect with these shared experiences, how mental health and physical health are interrelated, and that there isn't a clear distinction between economic costs and public health costs. Scholars use the term collective trauma to describe the psychological impact when a group of people experience the same event. This includes things like wars, mass shootings, natural disasters, and of course, pandemics. COVID is a shared global experience, but in the United States, this overlaps with rising social and political tensions, all contributing to our collective experience. In 2018, social worker and trauma expert Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky published a book titled The Age of Overwhelmed, aiming to ease our burden of overwhelm, restore our perspective, and give us strength to navigate what is yet to come. I doubt she knew a global pandemic was on the horizon, but she did give voice to the many variables that coalesce for individuals and communities, creating this sense of overwhelm. We're all in this together is a common mantra we hear these days. And while it's important to acknowledge those shared experiences, it's also important that we hear each other's individual stories. Typically, when we experience challenges, both individual and collective, we come together. However, in this pandemic, physical distancing requirements have posed challenges to our typical ways of coming together, and we may not know how other members of the Luther community have been affected. Hearing other stories can be both validating and empowering. It can give us new insight into the experience of others and help us better understand our own experiences. We've asked each of our panelists tonight to talk a bit about how their health, life circumstances, and intersectional identities have been impacted by the pandemic. They'll share a bit about their support systems, their strategies for coping, and any lessons they may have learned as they've reflected on their time adapting to life during the pandemic. Sharing personal stories always requires a certain amount of vulnerability. I want to extend my gratitude to each of the panelists for their willingness to participate this evening. Before I introduce them, I wanted to also thank our sponsors, Luther College Counseling Services, Nina Amundsen Lifetime Wellness Program, Luther Disability Alliance, Active Minds, Center for Ethics and Public Engagement. I would like to now introduce each of our panelists. Professor Richard Mutisi is an associate professor of history and Africana studies, now part of identity studies at Luther. He received his master's in economic history from the University of Zimbabwe and holds a PhD in history from the University of Iowa. He's been teaching at Luther since 2005. In his free time, Richard enjoys spending time with his wife and children, as well as watching Chelsea, his favorite English Premier League soccer team. Jaden Gasper uses she, her pronouns and is a sophomore at Luther, following the pre-medicine track and double majoring in psychology and neuroscience. She's currently the co-chair of the Luther Disability Alliance and a member of the other organizations such as TRIO, Health Sciences Club, and the Council for Exceptional Children. In her free time, Jaden enjoys spending time with her friends and cat Milo, watching horror movies and reading. Joshua Rattel Khan is the interim assistant director of the Center for intercultural engagement and student success, and uses they, he pronouns. They received their bachelor's in communication studies and political science from Ball State University and their master's in communication rhetorical studies from Syracuse University. This is his first year at Luther, and he's excited to be a part of the Luther community. In their first time, Josh enjoys playing Animal Crossing and listening to podcasts. Kim Chom, a senior international studies student at Luther College, and uses pronouns she, her, hers. She is an international student from Cambodia. In the last 3 years at Luther, Kim has been heavily involved in her work with the Center for Sustainable Communities, the Center for Ethics and Public Engagement, as well as her role as group fitness instructor through recreational services on campus. Some of Kim's most enjoyable activities are playing sports, singing, having life conversations with friends, being in the outdoors, drinking coffee, and loving food. Each of our panelists will share their stories in the order in which they were introduced. Again, I want to thank each of them for joining us this evening to share their experiences coping with the pandemic.
Good evening, everyone. Like many Americans, I can't say for sure how I got it. Maybe my wife brought it from her place of work. She happens to be a healthcare worker. Maybe it came from a routine errand to the grocery store. Maybe it was something else entirely. What is certain is I contracted COVID. So did my wife and 3 kids. My symptoms were relatively mild, but for a good 2 weeks, I suffered from severe muscle pain, body aches, extreme fatigue, fever, chills, shortness of breath, brain fog, and loss of taste. I could not smell anything either. A week or so into my symptoms, I started coughing. The coughing went on for a good 3 weeks after my other symptoms had dissipated. As I speak with you tonight, I feel as though I've recovered. But what is recovery, especially from a disease about which a lot remains unknown? While physically I feel like my old self, the mental stress and anxiety that COVID has had on me is difficult to quantify. So are the unknown long-term effects of the disease, or the so-called long haul syndrome. I can't say there is anything unique about my personal experience with COVID. The reality is COVID has forced all of us to live in new ways. Like millions of other families, my family and I had to scrap our plans for a summer vacation. For me, not being able to do things that I used to take for granted has been pretty challenging. Like so many others, I miss the daily routines of life, such as going to Walmart, going to a shopping mall with the kids, and taking walks without having to worry about social distancing. Yes, not being able to experience the joy, comfort, and warmth one gets from hugging other beings has been quite difficult. Upon the return from school, I find myself debating whether I should hug or not hug my little children, let alone people who do not live in my household. Like many other stayed away courses, my JTM stayed away course to South Africa got cancelled. While the decision was necessary and understandable, it only deepened my sense of helplessness, for I know how important these courses are to our students. For many, this was their only opportunity to study in a different culture. As an instructor who comes from Southern Africa and who cherishes taking students to that part of the earth, the virus robbed me of that opportunity. In my household, the shift to online learning meant that my wife and I had to assume more responsibility in teaching our 3 kids. This experience was quite eye-opening, but also stressful as I tried to juggle my own work and help the kids with their homework and schoolwork in general. My entire experience gave me a better sense of appreciation of the work that teachers do. As a faculty member at Luther, the unforeseeable switch to online learning wasn't an easy one. For someone like me who derives real joy from in-person learning, video recording a lecture or speaking to the students via a screen did not come easy. It made me feel like a part of me had died. But the shift to online learning also created some opportunities for me to try out new things. For instance, this past September term, I asked my young brother, who is an environmental lawyer, to talk to my students via Zoom. Equally worthwhile was a talk by a South African who until 2014 worked as Nelson Mandela's personal assistant. While there are many positive takeaways from my experience with online teaching, Other aspects of the pandemic continue to bother me. For instance, I feel as though the pandemic has exposed some of the fault lines that exist in this society. Not only has this pandemic coincided with racial tensions over police brutality, but there has been a disconcerting debate over a simple public health measure such as wearing a mask. I'll never forget the day I got confronted by a white guy who literally mocked me for wearing a mask inside our local Walmart. Would he have challenged me if I were white? I simply do not know the answer to that question. For the record, I was not the only person wearing a mask. As a person of color, I also continue to be bothered by the disproportionate impact the plague is having on racial and ethnic minorities. But there's also a silver lining to my own experiences. Despite the meanness and indifference that threaten to tear this society apart, I've not lost faith in the inherent goodness of humanity. A number of my friends and colleagues from work helped me to pull through during those difficult weeks in mid-August. Their support ranged from well wishes via email or phone messages to friends like Victoria and Robert Chrisman and Jack Wilkie, who brought meals and groceries. As someone who was born and raised in a far-flung corner of the world and have no family members living in the US except for my wife and kids, having this network support made me and my family I feel that we were not alone. The first day of class was quite nerve-wracking for me. Since March of this year, this was my first time. This was the first time I found myself in a group of more than 5 people. As I stood in front of the 20 students who were taking part in my seminar in South Africa, I felt quite nervous and felt like running out of the classroom. But I also suspected is probably a more fitting word, that the students were also likely terrified. I could see it in their eyes. They gave me solace. It gave me a feeling that we were in it together. I'm also encouraged by the work that the healthcare workers are doing. I'm not just saying this because my wife is one of them. Their resilience in the face of this pandemic and in the face of unwarranted insults from the Trump administration gives me a lot of hope. Above all, I'm simply grateful that I'm alive. As of this evening, well over 240,000 Americans have not lived to see this day, and many more are bound to get sick or to lose their lives to this pandemic. Thank you, everyone.
My story in regards to the pandemic is quite different than most people, and that is because I am immunocompromised. I have cystic fibrosis, and to give a little context, that is a genetic disease that deals with the lungs and digestive system. And a lot of the symptoms and issues I deal with on a regular basis are very similar to symptoms of COVID. A lot of the difficulty to breathe, clogged airways, and the GI issues as well. And so throughout much of my life, I've experienced a lot of this. And in high school, I was very sick and I was in and out of the hospital. And my freshman year, I was very isolated. I ended up having to drop out of high school. And that, weirdly enough, actually prepared me for the pandemic. Isolation was hard. And I had issues with being away from campus and being in an online format, mainly because for me, I get injections every 3 months because I also have hyperchronic tension. And my hospital where I got it at completely shut down. They did not allow anyone into the hospital. So I went over 6 months without some of my medications as a result. I had a lot of issues during spring semester when we were at home. I had started getting migraines as a result, and it made it highly difficult to stare at a computer screen in the online format and continue my work. Luckily, my professors were very accommodating and helped me with this. I was also having issues with wearing a mask, having issues breathing. Sometimes it can have an effect on that. And the thing is I was also used to having to wear a mask. whenever I went to appointments, every time I stepped into the pulmonary wing, I would have to put on a mask for my own safety. And so wearing a mask wasn't a foreign thing to me. I already owned some, so I didn't have to go out of my way to get some more. And I was actually also used to physical distancing. I had, with cystic fibrosis, a lot of people with cystic fibrosis cannot come into contact with anyone else with CF. And this is because the cross-contamination. And because of this, you can end up getting sick if you come into contact with people. And this prepared me as well. But I still had issues with it. It's unconscious to just walk into a store or walk out of your dorm room, and sometimes you forget a mask. I started doing little tricks to help me remember. I put a hook on my door to help me remember. And I started doing a lot of things for little tricks to help me remember certain things. Now, when the pandemic started, I was very nervous and panic-ridden about this new scary disease that started spreading across the nation. I was especially scared because being immunocompromised, I was the key target for this. Now, not to mention, it also targeted all my weak spots with the lungs, the digestive system, things I already had issues with. And for me, if I were to get this, it was a life or death situation. And I had people constantly checking up on me. And though I loved the support I received, sometimes it kind of made me more panic-ridden. And because I was getting texts daily about it, and I was trying to get my mind off of it. I, at one point, became obsessed with checking up on the media, and I would constantly look at how the disease was progressing and how it was spreading. At one point, I realized that it was too much for me to look at it. I made a rule of myself to stop looking at all the information. I would allow myself only to do it every couple days instead of every couple hours that I was doing it. I also developed a lot of coping techniques to help me with the isolation and being away from friends. I would make sure that I talked to my friends regularly. I started using little tricks. I adapted and added a lot of self-care routines into my schedule. For example, I would put my phone away before certain times. And so instead of looking at my phone before bed, I would read. This helped me de-stress throughout the day and figure out how I was feeling and just let me relax. Not only did this help me reduce my stress during the pandemic, but it also allowed me to sleep a lot better. I also started doing affirmations, which is a skill that I picked up during my J-term course last year. I starting off the day by saying, I am healthy and I am strong, or simple words like that. And my Nana and my friends helped me a lot throughout this time. My friends would check up on me, and though sometimes it made me more nervous and panicked, it showed that they care and it helped a lot. I would have my friends remind me of certain things, or like when school started, I had a friend contact me and ask me how I was feeling about coming back to school, because I was so nervous about that, especially in regards to the calf, because it's hard to regulate somewhere where people are constantly going in and out to get their food. And not to mention, you have to take your mask off to eat, and it's a panicking process. Every time I walk into the calf still now, I get nervous, and I try to find a place away from most people if I eat in the calf. Now, with my issues, I realized that this actually has helped me learn a lot more about myself. Now, for example, wearing a mask, right now I'm taking a yoga skills course, and it allowed me to actually be more cautious and realize my limits, especially with my breathing issues. It allowed me to become more in tune with my body and listen to what I actually needed. It's also allowed me to appreciate life a lot more and realize that tomorrow isn't necessarily a given. I've known a lot of people that have actually gotten COVID, and being from Wisconsin, where right now there are so many cases, especially in my county, I'm scared for my friends and family. And because I have to go back during break, because I have appointments and that I can't miss and have to be in person, I don't have an option but going back. And it makes me scared, but it's what I need right now. And it allows me to realize that sometimes, even if you're scared, sometimes you don't have control over it, and that's okay. And that's a lot of what I've learned throughout the pandemic, that sometimes you don't have control and it's okay. And that's my story.
Hi, everyone. I'm Josh. My story in regards to COVID starts when I was a graduate student at Syracuse University in March, finishing up my last year of graduate school. So when the pandemic hit, I was actually in the middle of participating in a Black-led student protest at Syracuse University called Not Again SU. It came up in response to 12 incidents of racist and anti-Semitic graffiti that popped up around campus. And the protest was in response to the administration's poor handling of those incidents. And so the protest began by occupying a building and doing a sit-in. So students would stay there day and night, protesting about the response. They had a list of demands that they wanted the administration to meet. So as the pandemic was going on, we had been occupying it for about a month. And it was a pretty traumatic experience. At the beginning of the protest, students who spent the night, the first night, were basically like locked in. They were free to go basically, but no one was allowed inside. And so they didn't have access to food, medicine, and couldn't shower for the 3 days that they were stuck in there. And then the rest of campus got, very upset about this, went to the building, was outside. There was like skirmishes with DPS. It was very intense. And so none of us had really processed everything that had happened. And so when the pandemic hit, the protests just had to end. We weren't, able to occupy anymore, and people just went their own ways. So there wasn't a lot of closure going on. Simultaneously, I was working on my thesis in order to graduate. And because I had been participating in the protest, I was pretty behind on getting my work done. So as soon as the protest ended, I didn't really, have time to process it. COVID was happening. I was really anxious about that, but just really threw myself into my work and trying to finish my thesis project. What kept me going, I think, was just knowing that I had some graduation plans lined up afterwards. I had applied for the Fulbright scholarship to teach English as a second language in Colombia. And I was super excited about that. My thesis project was really intertwined with that. I was researching about Indigenous gender identities in Latin America. And so I was just really thrilled, just trying to graduate and move on from what I had experienced at Syracuse. Simultaneously, as all of this was going on, my partner got sick right as the pandemic, started hitting New York. And we were, very concerned about that. She had a fever, and we, thought it was COVID. I didn't have a mask or anything at the time. The pandemic had just hit. So when I was trying to take care of her, I was using boxers as sort of a makeshift mask, and was just super anxious about, trying to take care of her, making sure that she was okay. While teaching online classes, I was a teaching assistant doing public speaking, which I was also, very unsure of how to teach public speaking online, since that was a pretty in-person course. So all of these things were sort of happening at the same time. And so I was super stressed out. But thankfully, my partner recovered. She tested negative for COVID. So thankfully, that was not the issue, and she was feeling better. So I was just trying to finish up my thesis and graduate and, move on to my next adventure. And then, a few months or a few weeks into the pandemic, I got a call from the Fulbright Commission, and they informed me that my scholarship had been canceled because of the coronavirus and them needing to slash budgets and everything along those lines. So I was, pretty demoralized. It was a heavy blow to hear. I had spent a lot of time, fantasizing, planning, practicing my Spanish, ready to move to Colombia. And to hear that that was no longer a possibility really was hard to hear. It was difficult to find the motivation to finish my thesis since it was so interconnected with that. And I just really struggled, to make those deadlines and make up all the lost time that I had on that plan. So after I had graduated, I wanted to sort of figure out what the next step would be. I initially had a backup plan that I was going to be a speech coach at my undergraduate university, but later found out that that job was also no longer a possibility because of budget cuts for the university. So in May, my partner and I had no plans for a job. Our lease was ending in 2 months, and the economy wasn't doing great, so we weren't very hopeful about finding job positions. And so we're just really, full of anxiety, going forward. Not to mention, on top of all of that, my cat was nearing the end of her life. She had been diagnosed with cancer in August and was starting not to, do so well. And so I was really struggling making the decision on when was the right time to put her down and wanting to spend the most time with her. So it was a lot to navigate all at one time. In addition to this, I'm a trans man, so I take testosterone injections weekly. And I ordered a new prescription, and the prescription box was stolen from my front porch. I wasn't able to locate it, wasn't able to find it, and was like, oh, great, another thing on top of everything that's going on. I tried, getting in contact with my doctor and the prescription company, but with COVID and, the post office being slow, it was just a whole mess. And because testosterone is a controlled substance, I wasn't actually able to get a refill until my refill date was up. So because of that, my hormone levels were just all over the place. And so as you can imagine, my emotions and my mood was as well. So it was really difficult trying to manage, a really difficult time in my life on top of the mental difficulties that I was having because of the lack of access to my testosterone. So it was just a really hard time. And I was really trying to find the motivation to continue my job applications and continue on with life while all of this was happening. What ended up being super, super helpful was that my partner and I came up with a daily routine. We wrote it all out and were committed to sticking to it moving forward. And I think in a time where there was not a lot of stability and, I'm sure as all of you can relate, time was just so weird during the beginning of the pandemic, especially. It was really hard to keep on track and keep a schedule and everything like that. So coming up with that schedule with her was super helpful. We decided that we were going to meditate in the morning, exercise. We're going to spend daily time with our cats. We had friendship time to reach out to folks and everything like that. So I think that was really stabilizing for me and super helpful during that really difficult time. Additionally, I think my natural instinct when I am feeling, depressed and anxious is to isolate. So I was having a difficult time reaching out to friends, even though that was part of our daily routine. But I think what was helpful is that I let my friends know about this, and they did a really great job of checking in and texting me, when I felt compelled to respond. So I think that also helped me stay connected to folks rather than just isolating and staying on my own. And I think what was also really helpful is I ended up getting into tarot cards during that time. So I was initially, pretty skeptical of tarot. My friends in graduate school were into it, but I'd never really heard of it before or was interested in it, I guess. But I decided to take it up as sort of a check-in practice with myself. So if you're not familiar with tarot, basically there's a spread of cards that you have, and you're able to ask sort of different questions, and you pull just different cards, and those are sort of like the answers to your questions. It's very symbolic, and as someone who's very analytical and likes to make literary connections, that's just something that I really latched onto, and was able to craft this narrative and have this daily check-in with myself. And I think as someone who likes to push everything that's hard away and not really come to terms with it, that was a really helpful practice for me to take up. Same thing with meditation. I wasn't, into meditation prior to COVID, but I had heard that it was helpful for other folks, so I decided to try it and ended up really resonating with it as well. That also led me into practicing gratitude, giving thanks about what's going on in my life and everything like that. So that was also, able to look at the positive sides of everything that was happening. And thankfully, the story has a happy ending. Obviously, my partner and I were able to find jobs as I'm here now. My partner got a job at NICC, the community college nearby, and I started looking for positions in the area. Luckily, came across the one that I'm at now, and it was just a perfect fit. And I feel so lucky and blessed to have this position. And I think that also helped me sort of lean into this narrative that I was also crafting for myself of, this trusting the universe, which I think before I thought of was maybe a silly phrase that I couldn't really relate to. But with everything going on, I was just sort of trusting that maybe I'm not meant to go to Columbia this year. Maybe I'm meant to do other things. And with this job and everything lining up so perfectly, I'm really loving Decorah and the Luther community. I was just able to really lean into that and embrace that more. So thankfully, I have a happy ending. Of course, we're still in the pandemic, so things are developing, but I think that routine was really integral to my sanity during that time, and is continuing to be a strong spot for me now. So thanks for listening. I appreciate it. Yeah, thanks.
Hi, before I start, just wanted to say that I really appreciate hearing from the last three panelists just now about their experiences. So now to share my experience. So my COVID story basically started on March 11th when I was sitting in a Maltese history class in Malta when we heard the news of Luther pulling out the Malta group student who's studying abroad to come back to the US. So to start with that, I am going to actually read an excerpt of an essay that I wrote that is from this de-isolation project. You might have seen around Decorah as well. And then we'll go from there. The coronavirus is in Malta. The airport is closing. Luther needs to bring the students and the program directors back to the United States. I know. It is the right thing to do. What does this mean for me? Visas eventually expire. A re-entry visa back to the States can't be acquired overnight. I can't immediately return without the updated visa. Sadness, disappointment, anger fill the flats as we were all spending the night packing. I'm not sure where I'll be in the next 12 hours. And I'm forced to say goodbye to the country that I started to fall in love with. At the moment, I can't return back to my home in Decorah, or my home in Cambodia, or my home anywhere. Flights are canceling fast, but I am in need of relocation. I am calm. I need to be calm. I need to think and react rationally. Panicking won't take me anywhere good, especially with the realization that I'll be on my own for a while, physically on my own, in Europe, a continent that was still so foreign to my 22 years of life. From the other side of the ocean, Luther is here for you. They've got you and will help you to find a safe place. I know. Their plan was to relocate me to Münster with another Luther group, fell through, and they are now returning to the States too, due to the border closing. At 4 a.m. in the Malta airport, I am informed to find my own place to stay for the time being. I am texting my best friend and my high school teachers. All I know is I will fly to Amsterdam, and then I don't know. At 6 a.m. in Malta airport, one of my teachers, now living in Switzerland, replied, "Kim, of course you can come and stay with us." Relief. Followed by 10 hours in Amsterdam airport. My best friend in Norway is keeping me company on the phone, and I'm talking to Luther whenever they are awake. Luther secured a flight to Zurich, and then my teacher will pick me up after a train ride. I have a place to go. That's all I need to know. You are stuck in Europe. I'm sorry, but Switzerland is so beautiful. Really not a bad place to be trapped. You are so lucky. I know. And I am grateful. I am not also worried about my family back in Cambodia, and I cannot be with them. From a distance, I am doing whatever I can, calling out to friends, creating a group to try to help people in Cambodian communities that don't have the privilege and luxury to work from home or practice social distancing. At one point, I am joining a 48 hours hackathon with people from Cambodia. We are communicating through the internet, working in teams to hack the heck out of this crisis by finding solutions to problems caused by the pandemic in our country. I am trying, stressing, and doing what I can to stay healthy. The scariest thing about this virus for me is, if I get it, I will be even more alone in an unfamiliar foreign country, thousands of miles away from home. If my family gets the virus, I will be alone worrying about them, thousands of miles away. Yoga, runs, walks, hikes, workouts with people on Instagram become my daily routine while trying to attend classes online and waiting for the United States embassy to resume the visa process. You are so lucky to have kind people around the world who are willing to help you, especially during this pandemic. I know. While the virus is killing people worldwide, homesickness for Decorah and family is beating me. Being in other people's space for a month with nothing certain about where I will be next or what the timeline looks like eats at me. The thought of going home to Cambodia, which might prevent me from returning to the States to continue college, terrifies me. Nevertheless, I am safe, healthy, fed, given a bed to sleep on in 2 homes, reunited with my high school connections. I celebrated Khmer New Year or Cambodian New Year by cooking Cambodian food for my teacher's family. I hiked through beautiful Swiss mountains with my teacher and later with my friend and her family in another area of Switzerland. Regularly, I receive caring and loving emails, messages, and calls from friends and family from all over the world, including my professors at Luther, to make sure I'm okay. A German family with whom I might stayed with, whom I never met, is in touch with me and showing me their warm and open hearts. My family back home is doing okay. I am lucky. I am having one hell of a semester abroad. What I hold on to throughout this time are health, hope, and love. Decorah, I wish to be reunited with you soon. So that was a pretty long excerpt actually from my essay. But that essay, actually, I wrote it in June, which was during the time that I was still in Switzerland. And that time, actually, I just finished my semester at Malta through Zoom and was heading into another online program, which was the Peace Scholars that Luther takes 2 students to attend each year. A program that I always wanted to join since I first came to Luther as a freshman and always tried to get in. And I was very pleased to find out that I got in when I was in Malta. But unfortunately, because of the pandemic, the program moved fully to online. So I basically attended the Peace Scholars program also, but in Switzerland and later in Malta and then in Cambodia. So the chaotic events that happened when I was abroad actually didn't stop there. So I eventually had to leave Switzerland when around July because I couldn't get a visa to come back to the US and the border was still closed. And so due to some other visa issues, I had to return back to Malta and stay there for a week. And then I left from there to go back to Cambodia, took that risk to basically apply for the visa to come back to the US. So 3 rides later, I got to go back to Cambodia. And when I got there, I got tested for COVID and then went right into quarantine for 2 weeks. And after quarantine, got tested again and then got to see my family for 2 weeks. And then I came back to the US, luckily got my visa and came back to the US and quarantined for another 2 weeks. And then I got to get outside and see my friends in Decorah. Yeah, so through all of these times, there were so many crazy events that happened. But the amount of support that I received from friends and family everywhere was just unbelievable. And those challenges that I was experiencing through that time was not just having to move physically, but mentally, I was really struggling to stay hopeful because of the uncertainty of everything. And I know that was the case for many, many people. So all these activities, I like to be very active. So all these activities really kept me going. And actually the week that we had to leave Malta, that was the week that my boyfriend actually came to visit me in Malta from Decorah. And he had to scramble and came back here to the US as soon as possible before the border closed. And actually got COVID on the way to, coming back here to Decorah. He's fine now and didn't get very sick. But I went through like 6 airplanes and like 8 airports or something to get back here to the US. And I didn't get the virus, which is really surprising. So something I'm very, very grateful for. And honestly, throughout this time, without my boyfriend's support and without my host family who lives in Singapore, and my own family and the friends who were hosting me in Switzerland, I wouldn't be able to survive all the craziness. So very, very grateful for that. And other things that I've learned through these things too is to be more okay, to be on my own, because being a college student, we are surrounded by people all the time, especially at Luther as a residential place. We don't really know how to be alone. And so through those times in quarantine, I actually got to just learn how to be by myself. I got to come back to meditation, and during the quarantine here at Luther, I remember I was not allowed to be outside, and I really liked to be outside. So those 10 minutes per day that I got to just go outside of the room and sit in the parking lot and feel the sun and the wind were probably some of the most beautiful times. So all these challenges really just sometimes make me more grateful, just like the other three panelists said as well, to be alive right now, to be safe and healthy, and to enjoy the little things that most of us take for granted when we didn't have to go through such hard times. And I am still dealing with a lot of these effects from the time that I was stranded in Europe and all, but to be able to do that together as a community, that helps a lot. So I'm just very grateful that I get to do this and to hear from the other panelists today. So that was my story.
Thank you to each of our panelists for sharing their stories tonight. Their narratives remind us all that although we've experienced a global pandemic, the ways in which our lives are directly impacted on a day-to-day basis vary considerably based upon a whole number of individual variables and circumstances. We heard in their stories the challenges, the physical implications, the implications associated with COVID, and magnified risks associated with underlying health conditions. We heard them talk about stress, anxiety, and fear, feeling that full range of emotions from anxious to relief, sometimes within the same hour. We heard about their fears related to access to medication and medical care. We heard about loss, not only loved ones and pets, but events, routines, plans for study away, the loss of physical closeness, and the loss of social connections. We heard him talk about uncertainty. How long will this last? Where do I belong? And how do I get to the places I need to be? We heard about helplessness and homesickness, not being able to be close to our loved ones and neighbors and provide them support through our physical closeness. And we heard about the disproportionate impact on specific populations and how that intersects with social, political, and racial tensions in the United States. But they also shared stories of hope and optimism that we can carry with us through this next phase of the pandemic. They taught us about learning new things like meditation and gratitude practices, about developing the capacity to be alone. We heard them talk about resilience, coping, and adaptation, the importance of daily routines. For some, it was the first time those were internally driven rather than externally driven, perhaps. We heard about their restored faith, as Richard Mutisi said, in the inherent goodness in humanity when people did reach out and care. We heard their gratitude for the familiar things that they may have taken for granted. And I'm grateful to each of our panelists tonight for sharing how the pandemic has impacted their lives. We all know that it's very challenging to share personal stories publicly in a world that is stable and calm. But sharing those stories takes even more emotional energy and courage in a chaotic and uncertain world. We're very grateful to each of you for sharing your stories this evening. Thank you. Typically, as part of this series, we do some small group discussion after our panelists have shared, but with this virtual format, we're going to do that a little bit differently through a Padlet site, where we invite community members to read, respond to, and share their own stories of how the pandemic has impacted their lives in big and small ways. This will give us an opportunity to continue to provide a validation for one another and continue to broaden our scope about the impacts that we may have never considered before. You can visit the website, I think that's going to be projected on your screen here, and add your own anonymous comments. I also wanted to just share a few additional resources. The Luther College Counseling Service website has a lot of COVID-related resources. Luther students and employees have access to therapy assistance online, otherwise known as TAO, which is self-led mental health resource, which is free to Luther students, faculty, and staff. That link is also on the Counseling Services website. And the Wellness Center also has a variety of well-being resources for students and employees outlined on their website. I'd like if each of the panelists could turn their video on for one last moment. I would like to say thank you again to each of them for their contributions, for their willingness to share their stories publicly, and for all the gifts that you have offered us as we enter this next phase of the pandemic. Thank you.